So we've talked about IGOs, MNCs, and NGOs. Now, is globalization good or bad? Well, it's a little of both, and it depends on what sort of lens you're looking at. So for liberals, liberal theories that look at interdependence see interdependence as a good thing. Interdependence is good because what you're doing is you're doing something that everyone can profit from. So state A might get let's put some monetary terms on something just for the sake of demonstration. State A might get $100 million out of this globalization process. Let's say the trade barriers coming down, and State B might earn $10 million off of that. But for liberals who are concerned about absolute gains, this is great. Both of them are doing better than if we hadn't taken down these trade barriers. For example, one aspect of globalization is reducing trade barriers. Globalization can mean other things from the liberal perspective. It's tied to democratization. This is international. The international community is formed around these democratic norms. So, for example, voting within the United Nations, within the commissions in the United Nations, it's not that a strong state has more votes than a weak state, large state versus a small state. They're all the same, except, of course, for the Security Council, which is warped and needs to be changed. But what we're doing is we're increasing interdependence. We're pushing these democratic norms by showing states how these democratic norms actually work, non-democratic states. And we're essentially providing a forum for greater public input, as I mentioned before, with the Amnesty International example, for example. And there are lots of areas where non-governmental organizations come in and they give their input, starting from the advent of human rights in the international system, where NGOs were quite involved in the process, and going all the way up to today, where NGOs can be observers, they can speak at certain intergovernmental organization forums. Now, from a realist perspective, interdependence is irrelevant at best. States only cooperate with intergovernmental organizations when it's in their own interest. Otherwise, they're going to defect. They're going to ignore them. But worse, say realists, this could actually create conflict. Now, notice realists are really focused on relative gains and losses. So when State A got $100 million and State B got $10 million off of reducing trade barriers, liberals were jumping up and down celebrating, but realists said, hey, that's a $90 million net gain for State A over State B. And that means that State A can convert that into military power. They can convert that into more economic power, more investments, and get stronger and stronger, and then go off and do things that are not in the interest of State B, whether that involves military intervention or simply manipulating the rules of the game. For example, other trade aspects, or whatever it may be. So for them, this is a zero-sum game for realists. Interdependence isn't necessarily so good because one group is getting a better deal than another. And again, think about the nature of the state and conflict. When we talked about how the state evolved, well, first we had external security, and then internal security came. Why? Well, because we had the haves versus the have-nots. So if you think about that, on an international level, the haves versus the have-nots, the LDCs versus the advanced democracies, for example, that could potentially be dangerous. Realists also fear that the technology involved in globalization facilitates the agendas of these small deviant actors. Think about organized crime. Think about terrorists. You have more trans-state cooperation, organization, recipes. All you have to do is look to the internet and figure out how to create a bomb. You've got more funding possibilities, wire transfers. Right? Now people just use their phones and transfer money from phone to phone. I don't even know how it works. So there are all these problems that realists point out. And finally, it's not finally, IGOs might increase democratic norms, but really they're filled with non-democrats. If you look at, for example, the Human Rights Council, and I've got in front of me a sheet from last year. So some of the members include Kyrgyzstan's on the Human Rights Council for 2012. Who else? Cuba is on it. China is on it. These aren't states that have particularly great human rights records. So this is an intergovernmental organization that represents human rights. And, well, liberals should be, well, I don't know. They shouldn't be jumping up and down, say realists. I should also note here that IGOs, from the realist perspective, can actually involve less democracy. We just talked about the EU a couple classes ago. The EU, as an institution, as a supranational institution, really removes politics further from the public's eyes. It's even less direct. Again, you go out and you vote for your government. You vote for a party. The party creates a government, perhaps with other parties, and then that government decides who to send. So it's 3 steps removed from the citizens who to send to the European Union. So that representative to the European Union is a few steps removed from the citizens. And finally here, realists point out that with multinational corporations, what we're really doing is we're triggering a race to the bottom, as I just mentioned, pushing cheaper labor, lower health standards, lower safety standards, lower environmental standards, etc., onto other states on these competitive pressures. So that's some good and some bad. And I'm not sure that realists would point to the multinational corporation issue, but that's certainly something that's a negative. So I shouldn't have put it in the mouth of realists. So let's talk about the economics of globalization. One of the great things about globalization was that it was supposed to bring technology and know-how all around the world. And what you found is you had this enormous jump in foreign direct investment. That's FDI. You should know what FDI is. Throughout the latter part of the 20th century. So in 1980, about 7% of the world's GDP was FDI. And then by 2003, FDI represented about 23% of the world's GDP. It's easy now. It's a function of technology. It's a function of competition. You can wire money anywhere immediately, relatively cheaply, thanks again to technology, to international banking. You've got reduced transaction costs. What I mean by these are things like the cost of communication, the cost of travel, the cost of doing business are far lower today than they were before. Go back to my grandparents in that 30-second phone call. How's the weather? How are you? Bye. You've got increased competition. So even where you've got import substitution, people might prefer to buy better stuff that's on the black market. Where you've got higher costs of production, people are going to pack up and move somewhere else. And, look at China right now. There's a lot of talk about how China's labor is becoming increasingly expensive. Well, yeah, because the Chinese people are doing better and better. They want access to more. They want to be able to afford more of these goods. And so what does that mean? Well, it means that companies can simply leave, go back to the race to the bottom. They can leave China and set up shop in Cambodia where things are cheaper. So FDI is supposed to be key. Okay, it's supposed to bring technology. It's supposed to bring know-how. It's supposed to bring new ideas, new ways of understanding, not just economics, but also local politics. Because once you have people standing around, a manager comes from, I don't know, Great Britain to China. Well, that manager is not only teaching people how to manage, how to maybe use certain machines, new technologies, but there are going to be discussions about how life is in Great Britain versus how life is in China. What works well here, what works well there. The political system. So it can be about local politics. It can be about national politics. All these things are supposed to be spurred by FDI, foreign direct investment. So in theory, at the end of the day, all of this should lead to a greater diffusion of wealth and potentially to political change as well. The big problem is that in the past couple of decades, FDI has largely stayed within advanced democracies, within advanced countries. So you don't have this flow of know-how. You don't have this technology flow. You don't have the flow of new ideas to the same extent. That's partly offset by the internet, etc. But a lot of the things that FDI was supposed to do hasn't been done. So about 60% of FDI stays largely within advanced countries. Now, according to people who are, strong supporters of liberalization and globalization, liberalism, right? State should be hands off. Well, what this should do, if the FDI is not coming to you, you should go to it. It should prompt an exodus. Go where there's investment. Go where there are opportunities. But for true liberal economics, you need open markets of goods, labor, and capital. Often the middle one, the open market for labor, is what's missing. We have strong immigration policies, right? We try to block illegal immigrants from coming into our state. Not just us, people around the world, states around the world. They put up big fences. They have border guards. They try to stop people from coming in. And they try to stop people from, quote unquote, taking our jobs. So what you should have is increased competition and labor changes. But what you have is increased competition. In other words, labor changes, labor movement changes. So the people move to other countries, and then they can get in on this. But instead, what you have is that more advanced states become more advanced. Others are stuck with lower paying jobs. Other states are filled with lower paying jobs. So the FDI is going largely to the rich, and you lack free labor. Okay, so these are some problems with the economics of globalization. There are also lots of sovereignty issues that I want to talk about. There's the risk of increased dependence as a country or group of countries gains a monopoly over certain vital goods. This could be oil dependence, gas dependence, or something less tangible but equally important, intellectual property dependence. So I'll give you some examples. The first case of dependence that you see here is Ukraine, and really about Ukraine and Russia, but it's more about Western Europe more broadly. So Ukraine is dependent on Russian gas, as is much of Western Europe. About 25% or a quarter of the total gas coming into Europe comes in is based in Russia. Okay? Now, this is problematic because this gas goes through the Ukraine, which since 2005 has had lots of disputes with Russia about what price it should be paying for gas. There was a dispute in 2006, 2008, 2009, and there were serious threats to the pipeline during each one of these turns. So in January of 2009, for example, Russia reduced the amount of gas going through the pipeline because of a conflict with Ukraine, which left some countries freezing for several days. So here are some countries that are 100% dependent on Russian gas. Latvia, Slovakia, Finland, and Estonia. And if you look at the pipeline here, you can see that the pipeline going to Slovakia, right over here, comes straight from here. So they're 100% dependent on Russian gas. Well, that means that they had a state of emergency in 2009. Then there are lots of countries that are less dependent, 80% dependent. Serbia, Bulgaria, Lithuania, the Czech Republic. So here, again, the Czech Republic, talking about Serbia down here, you've got more and more countries that are in serious jeopardy when there are fights over here. You've got countries that are 60% dependent. Greece, Austria, Hungary. So this dependence, which in theory should be a good thing, we should all be interdependent, but this is not interdependence, this is dependence, which means that Russia can really turn off it can turn off the taps when it wants to. Now, all this has been about Ukraine and its conflict with Ukraine, but you could imagine that if Russia was angry about something that the European Union did, very angry, to the point of near war, Russia could literally cut off the gas supplies to Western Europe, and that would have devastating effects on Western Europe. Now, the remedy could be developing coal or nuclear energy in Western Europe to a greater degree, but a lot of this, it takes years, even decades, to do in order to reduce your dependency on one particular area. So another example of dependence is the Brazilian case of AIDS. The Brazilian government was threatened with an AIDS crisis in the 1990s. There was political and moral pressure on them to do something about this, to stop AIDS. It's this devastating disease. And in a 1996 law, they promised free, universal provision of antiretrovirals, what they use to deal with HIV. The problem was that these are expensive. They were expensive because the patents were held in the West. The answer that the Brazilians came up with was that they would allow the Brazilian companies to break the patent. They would also allow for the import of the cheapest generics from abroad, even if they were illegal. They had already been patent breakers from abroad. They were sending these things to Brazil. This would bring costs down dramatically, but it also had major ramifications for pharmaceuticals. And these pharmaceuticals, through the United States government, brought complaints against Brazil to the World Trade Organization. The dilemma here was, do we let people die today or risk that pharmaceuticals will quit, will stop trying to develop these very expensive antidotes because they have no incentive. They're not going to invest in future vaccines and cures for tomorrow if they know that they're not going to earn money off of them. So again, Brazil was forced to actually abdicate from some of its obligations through an intergovernmental organization, the WTO, in order to violate these patents in a way that it would provide its people with, again, what's it supposed to provide its people with? Well, security. This is health.